Today we're going to talk about transitions, specifically the transition from the local ridge to the Catfish Ridge. When we talk about transitions, we often note that these are kind of hinge points in a ridge flight. They're often the times when that things can get a little tricky. And so typically a transition is going to be a place where the ridge no longer is going to work or something like that, or you're going to get into a section that is not so great ahead of you, and so you have to go from one ridge to another. And so the transition here is we are going to from the high ridge to the low ridge. And the reason that we do this is because if I turn on that penalty zone ahead, that area, that's a high ridge that is shadowed by the low ridge. It's a box canyon. Basically, that ridge doesn't work very well. If you go in there, it's bad news. A fellow that tried to go in there a number of years back ended up falling off the backside, landed in a field at the base of the ridge, and broke his glider in the process. So, don't go in there. But in order to continue flying northeast bound, you would have to go and make that little jump from the high ridge to the low ridge. So when we talk about transitions, we note the fact that, well, in that little area, you might not necessarily find ridge lift anymore, right? And so you would have to basically make sure you have enough height to get from the high ridge to the low ridge in this case. Now, in these kinds of situations, you're going to be dealing with a pretty stiff headwind. You might find quite a bit of sink along the way, and you might lose quite a bit of altitude. And so there's quite a bit of technique that goes into transitions in general, and it's pretty often the case that when they don't work out, it can get quite scary. You can find yourself a lot lower than you want to be, and quite a number of ridge-related landouts are due to transitions not working out. On my part, if half, if not more, of my landouts have been related to transitions not working out along the ridge system. So, in any case, when you go about these jumps, big or small, it very much pays to have energy in reserve. So if you approach them conservatively, if you gain additional altitude, and you go about them in a responsible way, you can mitigate your risk in a flight considerably, and you can avoid landing out. If you go in them, they're a little bit too low, you find some sink, and you're not decisive about your decision making, you can find things unravel very quickly. And so a lot of the higher level kind of discussions, when we talk about advanced stuff, we'll talk about things like, crossing the water gap or wind gap and things like that. Well, those are really tricky transitions, but, that a lot of the kind of things that you would be thinking about once you get to the next level is how do you, do them safely and efficiently. So, nonetheless, this little jump ahead of us, it is an excellent little training tool. In the beginning, it's pretty intimidating, but then as time goes on, you can really figure it out to perfection. But that being said, even this little jump has all it has all of the features of a transition. So there are kind of 5 steps. The first is to float up and gain some altitude, and sometimes if if floating up is not enough, maybe even finding a thermal. The second step is to find your line. And in this case, I marked the point where we're going to make the jump with the first pole, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But basically, you want to there's a bit of a strategy associated with where do you make the jump. You oftentimes will want to, for instance, find the area where there will be like good air, and with some experience, you can figure out where those places are going to be along the whole ridge system, actually. If not for that, then if you have good altitude, maybe even just find the closest spot to make the jump, with the least headwind component. Then the third step is once you are at that point, you start probing upwind. And if you find good air, and you're maintaining your altitude and you're pretty high, that's great. If you find a whole bunch of sink, well, then you may be approaching which is step 4, the point of commitment, or the point of no return. And basically, before that point, you can still turn around and go back. And so if you turn around and go back, you can then try again. But if you go beyond that point, you're no longer able to get back. This is less so the case in these little jumps. This is much more the case in the big jumps, but we'll demonstrate that in a bit. And then finally, once you cross the point of no return, now you're committed to keep going. You can't turn around. You have to keep going, and it's either the transition is going to work for you or it's not. And if it doesn't work for you, then you're going to be looking at the landing options at the base of the ridge. In this case, the typical bailout, the field at the base of the ridge, or some of the fields at the base of the Catfish Ridge. So let's go about step one. Let's go and float up here. And and basically that kind of transition to the point where you say, okay, I'm not going to be on the low ridge anymore. I want to go and get a bit higher. If you transition at the right time, you can you can make the ridge do most of the work for you. You're not going to have to do S-turning and weak thermal and all this kind of stuff once you get to where you're going. And so we're doing great because this is a moderate to strong day, and so the ridge band is pushing us up very, very nicely. Now, when you go about this jump the first time, hey, you can get in there, you can find a thermal, and you can get across with plenty of altitude and not even worry about the kind of the details of what we're doing. I mean, if you go and you thermal up to 2,400 feet or 3,000 feet, it's really not much of a jump at all. And the lower you are, the more sporty it gets, of course. But even in a 126, 2,100 feet ought to do just fine. And so we're floating along, and we're basically looking at this crossing here. And note again, that area ahead of us where we're not flying, because that's the Box Canyon. And so at this point, we're just going to round this point, and we're going to stop here. So, a couple remarks. The first is, one of the features of this area is that there's this little gully, which is a little hard to spot from this altitude, but it's basically straight ahead, right toward the river. And that gully has a wonderful feature in that it lines up an energy line straight downwind of it. And Condor doesn't quite simulate this, but in real life it's very consistent. So the line making this jump is almost universally going to be get just about beyond this area, float up, and then get downwind of the gorge, and then just run up the gorge. And you'll oftentimes find good air along the way. But, now that we have found our line, in this case, it's very nicely lined up. But even if that really wasn't the case, I mean, you would just get as close as you can and start going for the jump at altitude. Now we start probing. And what we're doing now is we're probing upwind. And we're asking ourselves, and if we hit some sink, then we're going to be definitely looking over our shoulder and thinking about coming back to the ridge behind us, and in this case, the ridge is about 1,500 feet high MSL, so if we probe along and we get down to about 1,800 feet, we can still always turn around and get back to the ridge. So we have a couple hundred feet of margin to spare. So we're just going to go and float along, and if we start finding sink, we might drop the nose and speed up, but if we're going to probe along in good air, we're just going to just keep doing exactly what we're doing. And so far, so good. It's worth emphasizing how important this art of finding the line is. And every transition has its own kind of subtle ways of doing it. If you find the line and you find good air, you can probe along into the wind and you do just fine. But if you are, especially in the low-performance ship, and you try to drive into a 20-knot headwind and sink, you're just going to fall right out of the sky. And notice that as we're probing along upwind, we're not angling toward the ridge. We're just going straight upwind because we're making the line do the work for us. So if we're going into the wind and we are basically pushing away from the ridge, we're always in a position that we can easily fall back and turn around or angle to the right once we're ready. So we're maintaining our options very nicely here. And so we just keep floating along, and in this case we're just about lined up now with the upwind ridge, plenty of height, and we can start turning to the right and completing the jump. Now, because we found a nice line, because we had plenty of height, we never were in a position that we couldn't get back to the ridge. And so we never reach this kind of point of no return, which is very nice. It's actually a nice reason to do your jumps higher, because if you do your jumps higher, then you maintain your options longer. And we'll demonstrate what happens when you do a jump lower and hit some sink and how you reach that point of no return. But if you were to do the jump in this manner, and float up high, work your way up in the line, and complete the jump as we did, it works out great. And at this point, we've made it across, we've committed to the jump, and everything worked out. Now, if we did hit some sink, we had enough margin, we had plenty of altitude to drive along into the sink and drive on down, and along the way, we also had our landing options off to the side, right? So as we do a jump, we are very, very mindful of of knowing exactly where the landing options are, because if you go and you hit a lot of sink and you have to drive into the jump, then you have to be ready for the ridge to not work. And in a transition where, kind of on these bounds or these gaps or these bowls, that's where a ridge is more likely to be finicky and not work. And so you definitely want to be completely on top of your landing options. So to sum up, kind of the straightforward technique here is, that when you approach a transition, in this case the catfish jump, there's 5 steps. The first is you want to float up and maybe thermal if you feel you want more altitude. And then at the second step is to find your line. And this is, in this case, we have that beautiful gorge that lines up the lift for us, and that's great. But if nothing else, basically position yourself at the nearest point to the transition, adjusted for the wind, of course. The third step is then you go from the point when you want to kind of start leaving, and you probe upwind. You're not committed to the jump. You are just going along and feeling what the air is doing. In this case, we were 2,100 feet, floating along very nicely, and we just kept going and going into the wind. And we managed to maintain our altitude all the way upwind, and then we just cut right across, and that worked great. But if we started at 2,100 feet and started hitting sink and sink and sink, and we watching our altimeter unravel, then we would think about turning around. And at 1,800 feet, easily you can just turn around and come back and try again. So there's this the third step is to probe upwind and feel how that transition is going and monitor how it's going. Now, at some point, you're often going to reach a point of no return. So if you get down to say 1,800 feet, more or less, and you say, well, I think I got it made, then you're going to aim at the transition at the next pole over here and basically go for it. But once you decide to go for it, you have two options. You're either gonna complete the jump, or you're gonna have to land at the landing options at the base of the ridge. And at that point, you've committed to the jump. And so that's about it. And kind of and again, the big thing to think about here is, transitions are hinge points, and so if you go about them conservatively, you will they'll be generally fairly low stress, and in your risk associated with the ridge flight goes down quite a bit. If a transition does not work out very well, then things get really sporty really quickly. You're going to be having to try to fly the ridge very low and slow, and you're going to be possibly falling off and having to make a tricky pattern into these kind of landing options. And so, when transitions don't go well, things go pretty bad pretty quickly. So, definitely pay a lot of attention to the transitions as you go about them. This is an excellent one to practice, but then as time goes on and you start thinking about the Delaware Water Gap, Wind Gap, Snyders, and things like that, then all of these lessons still apply and will be built upon in the future.